Please smile. Okay. And then we'll wait 11 to start the webinar, the recording. Please smile. Okay. And then we'll wait 11 to start the, this is the echo from YouTube. Okay. In the meantime, let me, first, before projecting, let me start the recording. So I start now, the recording is 11. Okay, very well. And now let me also share the program for today very quickly. 1 and 2. Yeah. So while we're waiting that everybody is getting his seats, so good morning to everybody. Today is the 4th seminar in a row. Today, curriculum number 6, coordinated by Denis Sarijanis, will provide interesting lectures about health and ecosystems. And as you see, the program is divided in 2 main sessions, the morning session and the afternoon session. In the morning session, Marina Boido will introduce the topics. There will be 2 presentations. And then in the afternoon sessions, we will have 3 presentations. The last one will be given by an invited speaker, Professor Terry Chapin, and Denis Arijanis will provide at the end some conclusions and will lead the discussion session. So if you have questions or comments while you hear to the lectures, you can also write in the chat box. Remember that the chat box is also recorded, so we are taking note for all the questions and writing the answers in the same folder where you will find the presentations. Most of the presentations are already available in PDF format in the same Drive folder. So now let me then give the floor to Marina Boido. Marina Boido is an Associate Professor of Human Anatomy at the University of Turin and is also the Deputy Coordinator of a Master Degree course in Biotechnology for Neuroscience. She's an active member of our PhD. She's actually the Deputy Coordinator of curriculum number 6. And Marina, the floor is yours. So please, I leave you to introduce a program. Thank you.
I hope you already see my presentation. I think so.
Yeah, we see.
Okay. So thank you, Mario, for the introduction. Today I'm in charge of introduce the curriculum 6 and today's program. And I would like to start from the focus of our curriculum that is named Health and Ecosystems. And the focus of CU6 is on the study of the effects of climate and global changes on the health of the humans and ecosystems, including the alpine, the marine, and the freshwater ecosystems. So indeed, the climate and the global changes are important phenomena that are rapidly and extensively disrupting the ecosystems worldwide, and this in turn can have a dramatic impact, of course, on the human health. So main training objectives of our curriculum are here listed. So one is the study of the impacts of climate change on the structure, the function, and the health of the biotic and abiotic components of the ecosystems. And then, of course, also the study of the human health risks that are associated with the environmental, the climate, and the global changes in a context of the sustainable development. So I would like also to briefly mention the universities that are involved in this curriculum that are listed here, highlighted in red, so from the north to south of Italy, and there are 12 reference persons that are involved, this is, let's say, the dream team. So my amazing colleagues that I have the honor to meet in this experience that is new also for me. Some of them will give talks today, so you have also the opportunity to meet and discuss with them. I also try to summarize here the main research fields. So our expertise, let's say, that in line with the idea of this PhD is characterized by a strong multidisciplinary. You can see here that we are, let's say, experts in human anatomy as me, but also in biochemistry, environmental engineering, veterinary pathology, ecology, zoology, physical geography and geomorphology, systematic botany, medical statistics. I hope I mentioned all, but in case they are here all represented. And I think that it's very stimulating, this environment, this multidisciplinary environment is stimulating for us as teachers, as professors, but I think even more for the students. Here I also try to highlight which are the main sustainable development goals that are relevant for the research projects of this curriculum. And as you can see, they are many, in particular the good health and well-being, the climate action, the life below water, and the life on land are probably the most relevant. But also, I would like also to mention and to thank the real key players of the PhD, that are the PhD students. Our curriculum is not so big, as 12 reference persons. There are 12 PhD students, of course, and these are here represented in this concerning balanced gender. There is a little bit unbalance this year because 9 female versus my males, but we will see in the next years with the new cohort of students what will happen. And then I just want to summarize here again that today's program, already mentioned by Mario, probably there is just some few changes in the order of the speakers, but as you can see here for the introduction, we are almost done. Then the morning will be dedicated to the alpine ecosystem health and then to marine and freshwater ecosystem health. Then after the lunch break, at 3 p.m. we'll start again with the human health session, and finally with the bio-based enabling technologies for climate change mitigation. Of course, before the final discussion and conclusion led by Dennis Arigiannis, as Mario mentioned, we will have the honor to host today a real leading expert in the field, that is Professor Chapin. I would like just to say very few words, because it would be introduced more deeply in the afternoon by my colleague, Professor Cannone. And just to say a few words, Terry Chapin is a professor of ecology at the Department of Biology and Wildlife of the Institute of Arctic Biology in the University of Alaska. And his research addresses the effects of changes in climate and wildfire on Alaskan ecology in rural communities. So the talk in the afternoon that will finish this amazing day, I think, will be entitled Earth Stewardship, Shaping a Sustainable Future in Times of Climate Change and Raising Environmental Degradation. So I try to be brief because I prefer to leave additional time, if possible, to the session of today. So I already stop here and leave the floor now to my colleagues of the Alpine session. So I think that Mauro will start.
I will shortly introduce you the session on Alpine ecosystem health. There will be 3 different presentations. The first one will be given by Professor Mauro Guglielmin, who will speak about the cryosphere. So a very important ecosystem component and highly sensitive to climate change. Then there will be my presentation, and the third presentation, last but not least of this session, will be given by Professor Francesco Ficcetola, who will speak about the biotic consequences of glacier retreat. So please, Professor Guglielmin, go on with the first one. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome to all our students. Now I have to share my screen, so just where is it? Schermo. Just a moment. Okay, so I suppose that you can see the screen, is correct? Okay, thank you. As Professor Cannone introduced me, I will talk about the climate change impacts on the cryosphere. So my presentation will be almost all abiotic, but as you will see, there will be some information also about some impacts on the biotic systems on and around the cryosphere. So the first thing is, what is it, the cryosphere? Maybe for the PhD students that are going on in the curriculum 1 and also some of our curriculum, this part can be a bit boring and even too easy, but I think that we need to do this for all the other PhD students, and I hope to be enough clear about some definitions. So what is it, the cryosphere? As you can see in bold, the cryosphere is the part of the planet that is composed by ice or that contain ice. But what is it, ice? There are several types of ice because ice can be water that is frozen or is snow that can transform in ice after some deformation due to the time, the temperature change and the gravity. So there are several kinds of ice that we can find in the cryosphere. And this is one of the reasons because cryosphere is highly variable, both in the time and the space. I think that everybody of you have in mind some of the forms of the cryosphere, for example, the snow. But cryospheres is important also because it involves both terrestrial and marine areas. So maybe someone cannot immediately think that the cryosphere can be also on the sea and under the sea also. Cryosphere is really crucial for its influence on the climate, and at the same time is also affected by the climate change. So is a kind of loop between these two important parts of our planet system. Which are the main components of the cryospheres? As you can see, I listed 6 different types of cryosphere, and are not in a casual order, but are following an order that is related to their temporal permanence. So snow, sea ice, lake, river, and surface ice, as well as the frozen ground, are seasonal. So they occur during the winter or during the fall, start during the fall and continues during the winter, and sometimes also during the spring. But they disappear during the summer in the normal conditions. The last 2 components of the cryosphere, permafrost and different kind of bodies of ice and snow, are multi-annual. So they remain for more than 1 year. And so are the parts of the cryosphere that we can appreciate much better. So just to give you an idea of the distribution of the different components of the cryosphere. So in these images that is not easy to see, but is not easy to represent all our planet, you can see that in blue, we can see different types of permafrost. In black, there are the glaciers. In with the black dots, there are the ice sheets, and in pale blue, there are the ice shelves. The white is the sea ice, and the brown is the snow. Obviously, as you can see in the caption, the snow and the sea ice that are seasonal are represented on their maximum extent in different periods. And you can't see the lake and the river and the surface ice because their size is not possible to represent on the map at this scale. And in any case, is the less widespread part of the cryosphere. I don't have the time to describe in the vertical section the different part of the cryosphere, but they have a different thickness because permafrost can reach more than 1,000 meters of thickness. The ice sheet in Antarctica reach almost 4 kilometers of thickness, and the ice shelves normally are more than 300-400 meters thick. So the thickness of the cryosphere is also very different, also because the snow, for example, can be in sometimes only a few centimeters. Regarding the ice sheet, the ice shelf, glaciers, glacierates, and snowbanks. So the part of the multi-annual cryosphere that is clearly visible also from the space or from a UAV or from any kind of aerial platform, you can see that we have 5 different names in English because they are different. They are different both in terms of their dynamic, but also because not all are on the terrestrial, on the continents, but in the case of the ice shelf, we have that this kind of bodies are floating on the sea. The ice sheet, the valley glacier, I don't put any images of glacierates and snowbanks. Why? Because glacierates and snowbank are much smaller and they don't have a real flow, so they don't move, but are bodies of snow or snow that is transformed in firn, so a denser snow, a kind of denser snow. And these glacierates and snowbanks, they don't have a flow, so they don't move, and so are obviously much less important in terms of landscape modifications and ecosystems health. The snow cover is really important because it can change quite rapidly and change its properties in the time very easily. In particular, the albedo, so the capacity of reflect the shortwave radiation, but also its density and the thermal diffusivity that change the insulation properties of the snow. This is very important because the snow is one of the main drivers of the behavior of the glaciers, of the ice sheet and the ice shelves, but also of the sea ice and even of the permafrost. So the snow is sometimes completely forget, but is really important. And in these 2 images, you can see which is the trend in the last years of the snow cover during in the North Hemisphere during the spring. You can see that the snow cover tends to remain less time and to have a thinner depth in our hemisphere, but also in the southern one. And on the left, you can see that there is a kind of relationship between, is quite expected, between the snow cover during the April and the air temperature, the mean air temperature in the same months in the North Hemisphere. The sea ice is another part of the cryosphere, very important because even if it's seasonal, it sometimes can be also multi-annual in some part of the Arctic and of Antarctica. And it's really important because the occurrence of the sea ice, especially when it is covered by the snow, change completely the albedo of a very large portion of our planet. If you can see, for example, here, the Antarctic sea ice during the peak in the winter can exceed 16 million of square kilometers of area. And also in the Arctic, the area is very, very large. You can see also that there was a big reduction during the summer of the extension of the sea ice in the Arctic from the beginning of the measurements during the 70s, at the end of the 70s, until the last decade. While in the Antarctic, fortunately, we don't have the same. Even we have a little increase of the sea ice during the winter in Antarctica. And my particular fields of research is permafrost. What is it, permafrost? It is every kind of material that for more than 2 years, consecutive years, remains below 0 degrees. So is a physical state of the material. So is not depending from which kind of material we have in front. Permafrost is in the rock, permafrost is in the sediments, permafrost can be also under the sea. In the graph that I know that can be quite complicated is just to show that the temperature that during the year we have in the ground, so increasing the depth, normally during the summer we have the higher temperature on the surface, and the temperature decrease until a certain point that is called the zero annual amplitude depth. From that point, the temperature starts to go linear increase, towards the deeper part of the crust. During the winter, we have obviously the colder temperature that increase until this point. So this means that the upper part of the permafrost, everywhere, even in the high mountains of the inland of Antarctica, there are for even only a few days per year in which the upper part, even only a few centimeters, that are above 0. And this layer, the upper layer that can stay for a few days or some months above 0, is called the active layer. Permafrost is very widespread, is cover more than one fourth of the entire terrestrial surface, but as you can see here in the violet, but occurs also in a quite large part of the Arctic Ocean until 120 meters of depth. So just an example of the distribution in our Alps that is quite sporadic and above 2,400 meters above sea level. And the permafrost can contain different types of ice. So like in this upper picture, we have interstitial ice that is water that refreezes during the winter, or in the second picture that comes from Antarctica, a big exposure of more than 40 meters of thickness of relict glacier ice that can be preserved by permafrost. What are the climatic driving factors for permafrost? Mainly 3 are the climatic driving factors: the air temperature, the snow cover, and the incoming radiation. In these 2 graphs, we have examples of the relationship between, for example, in this case, with the empty dots, we have a ground surface temperature and the air temperature. And you can see that the air temperature and the ground surface temperature they don't have the same pattern because there is the snow cover that with in some days or some months can insulate or can even increase the colder temperature if the thickness of the snow is very, very thin. So the snow cover is really the crucial point, but obviously the snow cover can stay a longer time on the ground if the incoming radiation is less or if the air temperature is colder. So these three parameters are strictly related to each other. But coming back to the more important part of the lecture, what are the impacts of the climate change on permafrost? In this three picture, you can see three different kind of permafrost landforms. That is the main process in which in the polar areas, in the lowlands of the polar areas, the climate change can induce changes in the landscape and in the ecosystems. In this case, we have some mounds, some reliefs. In this case, we have depressions, drained depression, or lakes that fill the depression. And in this case, we have retrogressive fall slumps that trigger big landslides and the retrogressive changing of the coast along lakes, or in this case, along the sea. As you can see here, the white part of this ground is ice. Obviously, this kind of degradational landforms are more impressive, more effective if there is more ice in the ground. If the ice there isn't, is difficult to have important climate change impacts on the permafrost areas. But in the polar areas live many people, and these people build automatic weather station with the building, or building where they can live, or road, or pipelines, or mines, or caves. Many infrastructure can have big damages because the ice included in the active layers, or in the upper part of permafrost, can melt in a differential way from a point, as here where we have the depression, and only a few meters, this ice can melt less, and we can have, as a result, a relief. So is a very unstable surface where the people and the ecosystem have to survive if there is climate change that induce this kind of impacts. But probably the more discussed and more important impacts of the climate change in the polar areas is the potential emission of greenhouse gases like CO2 or CH4. And in this map, you can see the soil organic material that increase with the tone of the brown color. And in the blue and with the green are underlined the Yedoma areas. So Yedoma are areas of permafrost rich in ice, but also rich in organic content that forms above all during the Pleistocene. And now these are the areas in which the climate change induce a degradation through different processes, some very fast, that are the thermokarst processes, or some less speed, that is the thickening of the active layer. But both these processes induce the melt of the ice and so a subsidence in general of the surface, but also the start of the decaying of the organic matter with the emission of the greenhouse gases. And as you can see here, the amount, what is estimated or as the amount of gigaton of greenhouse gases that in these areas are storage in this moment is very important, because almost half, almost the 50% of the global soil organic matter is included in these Yedoma areas. And this means that when there is a thermocast, what's happened? Happen that the lakes can deeper and deeper and thaw the permafrost, and the ice is melting, and also the bubble of CH4 normally, mainly, can go out from the ground through the water, and at the end, you can see here that it's possible to fire the CH4 that can that is emitted from this kind of thermocast. But another important climate change impact is the change of vegetation. In this case, the enrichment of nutrients that the active layer thickening can induce in the polar areas lead the colonization of this Artophila fulva, that is another kind of grass that is not normal for this area. And these vegetation changes can affect also all the trophic chain until the fauna that is in some cases an important part of the life of the native people. Regarding the alpine condition, and for alpine condition, I mean all the mountains in the mid and low latitude, we have active layer thickening that can trigger rockfalls or debris flow, like on the Matterhorn in Italy during the very hot summer in 2003, or big, deep landslide, rock avalanche like Valpola landslide, in which the mechanism of triggering is much more complicated, because at a very deep condition, so around or deeper than 10 meters in the rock, the joints can be completely filled by ice, and the ice, if the temperature of this ice increase around 0 or even between -2 and 0, change completely its properties and facilitate the triggering of the landslides. But also in the Alps, another important point is the vegetation changes related to the surface instability due to the permafrost degradation. And the last thing regarding the impact of the climate change is the change of the water circulation and the water chemistry. Like in this example, in some cases, the water can have a complete different chemistry respect in the permafrost environment, respect the surrounding permafrost-free terrains. But coming back to the beginning of my presentation, I said that the cryosphere changed a lot affected by the climate change, but also the climate change can be affected by the change of the cryosphere. And an example is the sea level rise. So which is the role of the permafrost degradation to the sea level rise if we lost a lot of ice in the ground? We don't know. This is what the IPCC publish, and you can see that terrestrial permafrost not applicable. So we don't have enough data to say which is the contribution for the sea level rise, while we can have some models that can predict an increase of the runoff of the rivers, for example, due to the ice melting in the permafrost areas. As well as we can also see that there is a contribution relatively important respect the air warming, because the air can be warmed by the greenhouse gases that are emitted by the permafrost areas in degradation, but also by the changes of the energy balance due to the vegetation cover changes on the ground surface in the permafrost area. And this is all, so thank you for your attention.
Okay, Mauro, thank you. If you take out the screen sharing, I can share my screen.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. I will speak about the acceleration of climate change impacts on another component of ecosystem, which are plants and vegetation communities. I will focus mainly on the alpine environments, but with an insight also on what is happening in the polar environments. Now, I would like to start with a view to the past of our planet, because as you can see from this graph, during the past millions of years, our planet experienced past climatic changes with mean annual air temperatures at global scale changing a lot from 12 to 22 degrees Celsius. So if we consider the absolute scale, we are now in a cool period. But if you can see better this graph, you can also notice that the rate of change was much slowly than what is happening today. In any case, past climatic changes had a very important role in shaping also the evolution of the biota, especially since the last 600, 500 millions of years or so, when there was the colonization of the ground by plants that came out from the water environment and started to colonize the terrains. And also these climatic changes provided threats in some cases, but the extinction of some body were opportunities, very important opportunities, and opportunities for evolutions for somebody else, in particular for plants which are at the basis of the food web. So, and they are responsible of the sustaining of the food web and of the structure of the terrestrial ecosystems in particular. And here in the left, in the lower part, you can see a very simple graph showing that during the last, this is a shorter insight in the last 160 millions of years, and when we had the onset of conifers, the decrease of pteridophytes, and the success of the angiosperms, so of the modern plants. And all these changes were related to past climatic changes that were opportunities. What happened in our planet when it experienced the past climatic changes? What happened to ecosystems? The first presentation in this session was about permafrost, and Professor Guglielmin showed you that the permafrost thawing could release massive amounts of greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, but methane above all. In the past of our planet, we have a very important witness event of what could happen with rapid climatic change. That is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM, which occurred in our planet about 55 million of years ago, and was triggered by an orbital condition, a particular orbital condition of our planet, leading to the thawing of permafrost and to the massive release of carbon from soil that were carbon rich. So the example of the Yedoma that were mentioned before. And this had a very important impact on the global temperature, which increased of about 5 degrees Celsius. So half of the temperature gradient that we saw from 12 to 22 degree of mean annual air temperature at global scale. But this change occurred in thousands of years, 100,000 of years, and not in hundreds of years, like something similar to what is happening now. But which were the biotic consequences of PETM? They had very strong impacts on plants, and these impacts were so deep that it was possible to reconstruct them from fossils of plants. You can see the reference to these two papers. The first one is a reconstruction of the change of the community composition before, during the event, during the recovery, and after the event of hyperthermal. And you can see also the difference of the community composition represented in this multivariate analysis. And this impact was visible not only on the composition of the plants, but analyzing the fossils, the researchers recognize also the occurrence of a change in the insect folivory, so a change that was going beyond the change of plant composition, of community composition of the vegetation, but was extended also to the other ecosystem components. And this means that when you have such important climatic changes, you can have a cascade effect that involves all the biotic and abiotic components of ecosystems. And this is a very important lesson that we have to take home because the situation that we are experiencing now in our planet is in some words similar to what occurred in PETM. The only difference is that here the change is not natural, but is human driven. And the speed of this process is much faster. This is another reminder for all of us, showing that small, minor climatic changes in the history of the human beings, so the last 1,000 years, exerted an impact also on the history and the development of the human civilization, with the occurrence of prosperous periods and the expansion of the human populations, as well with the demise, the fall of some civilization, wars, currency, diseases. And this is important because these past climatic changes occurred during the historical period were much smaller than what is happening today. Why are we speaking about acceleration of climate change impacts? What is going on and how to recognize the impacts of climate change in the vegetation community and associated components? A paradigmatic work on this issue has been provided by Walter et al. In 2002. This is a really still very actual work because they made a review analyzing which were the ecological responses to recent climate change, analyzing different kind of ecosystems, marine, terrestrial, from the species to the community level, and analyzing different types of reactions. And they recognize that at global scale, the responses to warming may be observed and quantified at 4 different levels. So they include the phenology and physiology of organisms, so changes in their phenology, changes of the distribution, the spatial distribution and the range of species, so what is called a range shift, changes of the composition within communities, but changes within the composition means also that the interaction and the processes within communities change. And changes in the structure of ecosystems, in particular, if we speak about plants, if the main growth forms change, as an example, from the grassland to the shrubland to the woodland, we have a very important feedback on all the components and the processes of the ecosystems. And changes also of the dynamics that you will see in a few minutes are now accelerated with respect to what was the business as usual without the climate change impact. Which are the 2 most important and globally recognized impacts of climate change, of recent climate change on vegetation, especially recognized where we don't have a direct impact of land use change, so where we can have a monitoring of the natural trends of ecosystems. There are, again, very important milestones in the scientific research on this topic. 2 are indicated here. And we have 2 kinds of signals that we can identify. One is the shrub encroachment, so the ingression, colonization, expansion of shrubs that occurs towards higher elevations in mountain areas and towards higher latitude in polar areas, especially obviously in the northern hemisphere in this case. And the shrub encroachment has been identified as a global trend in the tundras where the ambient temperature was not so cold. In the extreme tundras, the other internationally recognized trend to triggered by climate change is the expansion of graminoids, because graminoids are plants that are adapted to cold, but also to warm, so they are able to withstand large temperature changes, but also drought, because another problem that could be associated to climate change and to climate warming, especially where permafrost occurs, is that the soil drainage can change. And so water availability, as well as snow cover, this is and the other problem, not only the active layer thickness, but also the snow cover and the precipitation regime can change. And so this means that the water availability can change, and this promotes the ingression of graminoids. Especially this is important in the high Arctic and in Antarctica. If we go to the alpine environments, why the European Alps could represent a case study which could be a worldwide case study showing which are the trends, the universal trends that we see across the planet in the mountain areas. Because the European Alps were one of the 3 areas of the planet that in the 50 years between 1950 and 2000 experienced the highest rate of warming, with Alaska and Antarctic Peninsula. And in the European Alps, the increase of air temperature in that period was the double of the global mean. So it was 1.2 degrees Celsius in only 50 years. So you see more than 1/10 of the gradient of a total temperature change that we saw in the past of our planet. And I'm speaking about mean annual air temperature. In this context that has been subject to a very extensive and very intensive warming, There is another paradigmatic milestone work that has been produced by Theory-Guisan that synthesize which kind of reactions we can expect in such environment. We could have persistence, but persistence of species is possible only if you have a pool of individuals showing genetic variability, able to adapt ecologically and to perform a phenotypic plasticity. If these conditions are not suitable for the selected species, the only chance that plants have is to perform migration, which could be, in most cases, upward migration or northward poleward migration, because in this case, they can find conditions that are more suitable for which are their ecological requirements, the species-specific ecological requirements. Obviously, this is performed with the seeds and so with the further generations, and the single individuals that persist are not longer able to keep the colonization of the places that became no more feasible. If persistence of migration are not given possibilities, the only chance is extinction. That is initially local extinction, and then could be global extinction. So you can see that there are not many chances. There are three ways that plants can follow in this occasion. Which are the observed impacts of recent climate change on vegetation in the European Alps? You can see there are very, very, very many impacts, changes of distribution of a single species with, in most cases, upward migration of the alpine species of plants, shrub encroachment and upward displacement. So not only ingression and colonization, but also upward migration beyond the known elevation limits of the single species. Changes in community composition, but also surface areal changes. So this means that you don't see only single species migrating upward, but whole communities and elevation belts changing their spatial distribution and moving upwards. Loss of biodiversity. In this case, we will see something more in a very short time, because this is not an immediate impact, but it could be a very likely impact in a short time. Thermophilization, so the ingression of species that are adapted to cooler, warmer conditions, and the decrease of species adapted to cooler conditions. And there is the extinction depth. So some species which are not able to adapt and not able to migrate are destined to extinction, local and then global. But now we have also evidences of accelerated impacts at the moment with few works, but you will see accelerated impacts because warming and CO2 emissions are accelerating. I will show you evidences from a case study that we analyzed in the Stelvio Pass area in Upper Valtellina here in the Italian Central Alps. Because this site is very particular, as here in 1950, there was a very detailed documentation of vegetation, as Giacomini and Pignati, who are considered the fathers of the Italian botany, performed a very detailed vegetation mapping. So we repeated the vegetation mapping 50 years ago after, so from 1950 to 2003, and we had the opportunity to quantify the changes that occurred in terms of coverage. You can see here the green means increase and the red means decrease. Of dynamics, the green means towards more evolute successional stages, and the red towards more pioneer successional stages. But you can see here the shrub occurrence in 1953 and in 2003. So we can have, in this case, evidences of climate change impacts on large scale and not only species upward migration, but community displacement. And in this place, we recorded the highest rate of shrub expansion at global scale. And I can also indicate you that if you see here the highest part, the crest, it is strange. And so the title of our work was Unexpected Impacts, because we could expect, following the models, that the largest increase of vegetation could occur at the highest elevations. In this case, this is not the effect that we observed and quantified, because at the highest elevations, you have both progression and regression of vegetation, considering all the different drivers. And we hypothesized that it could be due to permafrost degradation at the highest elevation, triggering surface instability, and so decreasing the potential of plant expansion. We were among the first one speaking about acceleration climate change impacts, because we analyzed the dynamics of glacier-fulfilled colonization in the Sforzellina Glacier. And you can see here the reference, where in 2009, so much in 2008, so much earlier than the work that I will shortly mention you, we noticed that the dynamics of plant colonization were coupled with the glacier dynamics, but their rate was accelerated by 4 to 8 times than the business as usual. In the Stelvio Pass, we repeated the analysis of the changes occurred in 50 years, and I involved Professor Pignatti, one of the authors of the map in 1953, and we noticed that there was an increase of species richness that was due to the ingression of other species recruited from the neighboring areas. So the impact of 50 years of climate warming implied the increase of total species richness. But if we analyze the main components of the main vegetation series, the ecological series occurring in the area, you can see that all of them show a decrease of coverage, in some cases up to more than 80 or almost 80%. Among the impacts of climate change observed in the Alps, you can see the thermophilization, as I mentioned you before. But in 2018, Steinbauer spoke about accelerated increase of climate change impacts, and he quantified this on the richness, on the species richness of mountain summits. And you can see here that they made a work in different areas across the continent. And in all cases, they noticed that there was a correlation between temperature increase and species richness increase. At the Stelvio Pass, so coming back to the Italian Central Alps, we noticed that in the last 40 years, there was a very important process, because beyond the shrub encroachment that we dated at the end of the Little Ice Age, so the shrub encroachment started in 1867. Since the 1970s, so 40 to 50 years ago, started also the encroachment of trees. And this was due to the persistence of climate warming. But the tree encroachment following the shrub encroachment, beyond producing changes in the physiognomy, dynamics, and structure composition, implies a loss of habitat, and in the future, loss of biodiversity and cascade effect. And last but not least, this is online. This is a work that is online since 1 week. We also noticed that another process is now ongoing. So across an elevation gradient spanning more than 1,000 meters of elevation, so between 2,000 and 3,000 meters of elevation, we noticed in the subalpine, alpine, and nival belt the ingression of shrub salix belonging to 17 species, different species. Some of them you can see distributed also at very low elevation. So Salix appendiculata, Salix purpurea, they grow along rivers, and we found them at very high elevations. So above all the known limits of their distribution. And we noticed that the ingression and expansions of these species that are acting as alien species and are invading both the climax as well the pioneer communities, it was well related not only to air warming, but also to the increase of atmospheric CO2, which is an increase of its rate in the last 40 years. And these are two examples of what I mentioned you before. Similar evidences are occurring in Antarctica, where we have permafrost warming, soil changes with an acceleration of soil changes even in continental Antarctica, and a very large expansion of plants with the increase of the native vascular plants in maritime Antarctica and the ingression of alien species, non-native species. But this means that it is time for mitigation and adaptation. And thank you for your attention. I don't, oh, okay, interrupt. Okay, sorry, now it's, there is a speech of Professor Ficetola that will continue this session. Thank you.
Hi to everybody, it's really a pleasure to be here for me. I will continue speaking about the effects of climate change on biodiversity, focusing on the high mountain ecosystems, but also trying to describe how new methodological approaches, new techniques can help us to better measure how biodiversity is changing through time. So as Professor Guglielmina has already shown, we see huge modification in the cryospheres, and as Professor Canozene has shown, these has major consequences on the biotic elements. So just a few years after the retreat of the glaciers, we only have the exposed substrate with very, very limited amount of organisms that we can see, but the colonization of those ecosystems can be very, very fast. And in some cases, just 1 century after the retreat of the glaciers, we can even develop a forest. And understanding the biotic consequences of the retreat of the glaciers is extremely important. If we focus on the abiotic effects, like Professor Guglielmina has shown, we can certainly have important understanding of impacts on the hydrogeologic alterations or impacts on the energetic budget of the globe. But we have to remember that the colonization of those environments by life form also has consequences at the global scale. For example, we can suppose that inside the soils or the plants that develop in the areas that are liberated by the ice masses, we can have some stockage of carbon, and this could affect also the global carbon stock. Or it also should take into account the fact that the life forms have on the functioning of those ecosystems. As Professor Canone has shown, it's more than 1 century that biologists are studying how the communities develop after the retreat of the glaciers. But the problem is that so far, most of studies have been limited in extent or in taxonomic focus, because of the complexity of studying those ecosystems using the traditional method. In fact, most of the studies have focused on just one or two taxonomic groups. Somebody studied plants, somebody studied insects, somebody studied microorganisms, and generally those studies have been limited through space. So somebody studied a few glaciers in the Alps, somebody else in Scandinavia, and so on. But the problem is that with those limited approaches, it's very difficult to have a global picture of what's happening across the globe. So before talking about the impact of climate change on those ecosystems, I would like to introduce a different approach to study biodiversity. Because using traditional approaches, the study of biodiversity is complex, and sometimes it takes too much time, or it makes it complex to have an overall picture of the ecosystem. Think about what happens in a rainforest where there are too many species, and if you want to have a complete assessment of biodiversity, you will need months or years just to assess one single hectare of rainforest. In some cases, the species are very, very similar. Those butterflies represent different species, but they are extremely similar. So the traditional identification on the basis of morphology is very difficult. Or sometimes you are interested to the study of all the ecosystem. So for example, of what is stored inside the permafrost. Or sometimes we are interested to ecosystems that are, if difficult to assess. We all know that there is some fish in this lake, but we don't see them. And catching the fishes is not that easy. And in some cases, this is the example of identification of animals on the basis of small remains. The identification is possible, but it takes a lot of time. And this means a lot of money. About 20 years ago, there was the development of a new technique that is called DNA barcoding, that is based on the assumption that every single species has more or less a unique sequence of DNA. So the idea was we can try to use those unique sequences of DNA that are called barcodes to identify the species on the basis of the DNA extracted from tissues. So we can jump one step. So in cases where the morphological identification is difficult, we can use this new approach. However, these techniques can be extended to the study of the environment. For example, all the organisms that live in an environment, interact with the environment, and for example, if we take the water of a lake, inside that water, we can find the DNA of the organisms that live inside the lake. And we can use this environmental DNA to study the species that live in the lake. Essentially, we can use the DNA in a lake to evaluate which species of fish, amphibians, plants, or whatever you want live in this lake. So this always happens. You know that the police is able to know which person was drinking on this glass, because you will find the DNA of this person on the glass and even inside the wine. And the next step of this process is the use of what are called universal primers that amplify the DNA of many, many species at the same moment. So essentially, we extract the DNA from an environmental sample, we amplify the DNA, and we use what is called next generation sequencing to amplify the DNA of all the species that are inside the environmental sample. Or we would like to amplify all the species. It's not always possible, but we try to amplify as many species as possible. And the soil is a great environment to study the communities that are related to the soil, because in fact, all the life of our planet for the terrestrial ecosystems is strongly related to soil. So inside the soil, we can find the DNA of plants, because plants live above the soil, but then the roots are inside the soil. You have plenty of organisms, of animals, of microorganisms that live inside the soil. And in fact, inside the soil, you can even find the DNA of the animals that live above the soil, because the feces or the urine of those animals go down and then remains stored inside the soil. So to jump back to the issue of what happens after the retreat of the glaciers, in practice, we can try to use environmental DNA to study the whole community, not just one taxonomic group, and this would allow to apply a functional approach to finally have an idea of what happens at the global scale after the retreat of the glaciers. And this, of course, requires to focus on, to take into account the fact that we have plenty of organisms that colonize the environments after the retreat of the glaciers. So we should consider what happens to bacteria, but also to plants, to fungi, to springtails, insects, earthworms, and so on. And I'm trying to show you a couple of examples of what we can see on the basis of the data that can be pulled all together from multiple glaciers all around the globe. And this is possible because the glaciologists are collecting since many decades data on all the glaciers, or not all the glaciers, but on a very large number of glaciers that are retreating across the globe. Just to make an example, this is a glacier for Bolivia, for which we have excellent data, excellent information on how the retreat did happen through the last centuries. So essentially, this can be done in the field using environmental DNA by collecting soil samples of points for which the date of retreat is known. So you can go to the field. It's possible to collect soil samples, and then on the basis of the environmental DNA, you can understand which organisms live there. And now a couple of examples of what you can see. For example, you can compare the rate of colonization of many different organisms. So of course, we expect an increase of biodiversity through time, but it's not clear, it's not sure that all the organisms arrive at the same moment, and maybe somebody has a faster colonization rate at the beginning of the succession, and somebody else requires the arrival of other organisms. For example, if we compare different organisms like microorganisms, plants, and animals, we can have very different patterns. So for microorganisms, here I show you the pattern we see for bacteria and for protists. We can have a relatively high diversity value immediately after the retreat of glaciers. So we can have up to even 100 or 200 different species. Well, the species concept is not, cannot be applied the same way between animals and bacteria, but you can have a very large number of taxonomic units immediately after the retreat of glaciers. We have very rich communities, and yes, the richness of those communities increased through time, but as you can see, the increase is quite slow, and after a few decades, you reach a plateau. And the same happens for protists, so unicellular eukaryotes, for which you have a very, very, very slow increase through time. For the macroorganisms, the pattern is completely different because you see that, first of all, they don't start immediately the colonization. They require about 100 or 20 years. So they require that the microorganisms start to modify the environment, and this accelerates the colonization at the subsequent steps. And then you see an acceleration of the colonization, and the time required for colonization is quite long, because 200 years are not enough. You see that after 200 years, you still see an increase in richness through time. And these have complex consequences on the functioning of those communities. So, for example, very few years after the retreat of the glaciers, you already have some animals. In this case, just 3 taxonomic groups. 3 centuries later, at the same altitude, you have many more species, but you don't have just many more species, you also have many more functions. So, for example, at the beginning, the community is based on bacterivores and decompositors, while through time, you have more functional groups that arrive, and you have very, very few taxa in common, or perhaps nothing. And this leads to a modification of the structure of the food web. So at the beginning, you have a very, very simple food web, and then the addition of multiple taxonomic groups leads to a much more complex and complete food web. Just to sum up, you have strong differences in colonization rate across the taxonomic groups, and the microorganisms are the starting point that allow the colonization by the others. I know that time is not that much, but I would like to spend the last 2 minutes to also discuss the differences that occur across areas of the globe. Because we have glaciers on mountains all around the globe, from the polar region to the equatorial areas. And we can imagine that the colonization patterns are very different across climate areas. But we sometimes have a wrong idea of how the different areas of the world are. Actually, it's not necessarily true that in tropical regions we have a warmer climate. So, for example, this is an example. This you see on the left a 9 mountain ecosystem of the Ecuador, where the conditions during the growing season are much colder than what you see in the Alps. In this case, I'll show you a couple of slides about the nematodes. The nematodes are small animals. They are so-called worms that live in the soil and are the most abundant animals on the Earth, on the terrestrial environments of the Earth, because they are at the basis of the functioning of the soil. And they have a very, very diverse functional roles. They include predators, detritivores, some feed on plants. And here you can compare the colonization rate between the glacial forelands that are in relatively warm environments, so environments where in summer you have a warm summer, and in blue, the environments where summer is much more cold. In areas with warm summer, colonization starts much earlier than in areas with cold summer. So you have a much, much faster recovery of the ecosystems in relatively warm environment. But then through time, the two environments more or less reach each other. And after 2 centuries, you have more or less the same diversity. The same pattern is recovered if you measure the taxonomic diversity, so the number of species, or the functional diversity of your ecosystem. And you can even combine the information obtained through environmental DNA with life history information for that taxonomic group to study how the composition of the community changes. So, for example, for nematodes, immediately after the retreat of the glacier, you have species with very short life and limited fecundity and very high fecundity. And then this shift, the community shifts to species that are larger, live longer, and have a much lower fecundity. So even the composition and the traits of the species change quickly. So just to conclude, glaciers are retreating across the globe. This has huge consequences on the life of organisms that live in this area. And environmental DNA is a great tool, not just for those environments, but actually it can be used for any kind of environment to study how the impacts of human activities influence the modifications influence the community and determine the consequences of the ecosystem effect and also on the functioning of the ecosystem upon which we depend. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. Sorry to the colleagues for being a little too long than the time planned, and I leave the space to the freshwater and marine colleagues. Thank you so much. If you have some questions, because Mauro already responded to the questions, and there are no other questions. So if you have other questions, please put in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just a minute to share. Here I am. Okay, thanks to everybody. Can you hear me? Because I have problems with the, okay, perfect. Where is the sharing? Yes, okay. Thanks to everybody to be here, even if it's lunchtime, but we will finish on time to eat something, don't worry. In this session, we will speak about marine and freshwater ecosystem health following a salinity gradient. We have decided like this. So I will start from freshwater. In particular, I will speak about lakes. Then there will be Professor Galassi with the groundwater. I think freshwater, but I don't know exactly. And then last but not last, Professor Puceddu, who is also the chairman of this session, who will close with the marine lecture. My lecture will be very simple because freshwater and climate change, lakes and climate change, it's mainly new in a certain sense. First of all, I would like to introduce some main general concept about water. Here we can see that we live in the blue planet since about 71% of the planet is made of water, and in particular we can represent water in the planet as a drop, mainly made by salt. So Professor Puceddu will tell you everything. Salt water is 97%, about now 97%. And the small drop is made by fresh water, 2.5%. And of this fresh water, part is glaciers, already mentioned by the very interesting lectures by the colleagues. 31% is groundwater, and only 0.3% are lakes and rivers, and I will speak about them. This is, even if it's a small percentage, this is a precious source for the environment itself and for humans. And in my 15-minute speech, I will take what I would like to tell you, something to take home. The so-called take-home message is that to know some main characteristics of lakes in natural conditions, natural with no anthropogenic impact, and which can be the impacts of climate change on lake ecosystems and on water uses. Go deeper in my topics. What are lakes? Lakes are basins, mainly contain fresh water, sometimes brackish, sometimes salt, but mainly fresh water, characterized by many morphological and morphometric characteristics, among which surface area and depth are the most important ones to know. This is very important when defining geographical area we are studying. First of all, we can go through the main physical and chemical variables which are important to know for this ecosystem and climate. So the importance of light in the water environment, which is fundamental. So the sun is the most important to do for photosynthesis, increase or decrease of temperature, and from the point of view of organism, for predatory and escape strategies of organisms with different adaptations and so on. From this graph, assuming that the surgeon is constant and the light is monochromatic, we can see that the water transmission in water column in different lakes is different. And there are differences between lakes. For example, Lake Como with the water transmission which is dependent of the high content of phytoplankton, POC, particular organic matter, and dissolved organic matter. But even in Lake Maggiore during the different seasons, depending always on the presence of the a major or minor turbidity. How can we have an idea of transparency of a lake? We use the so-called Secchi disc, which is a plate, very simple plate made of metal or plastic. Can be white or black and white like this. And the use is very simple, but very important. Dropping the rope until it disappears and appears again, we have the important information about the transparency. And closely linked to the heat of water, of course, there is the temperature, strictly linked to density of water. That's its behavior is quite strange. In fact, if the maximum density of water is at 4 degrees, and then it decreases with the temperature, with increasing temperatures. So this is what is the consequence of the consequence of this kind of properties as effects on the physiology of the lakes. If we if we consider temperature and in the dynamic lakes that are year-round, we can say that in springtime, when temperature is still low and the water column is about at 4 degrees, there is the so-called spring circulation, same temperature at 4 degrees, thanks to precipitation, wind, and atmospheric processes in general, make this circulation, which is very important for the lake, because there is more oxygen in water, not only oxygen, phosphorus, silicates, and so on. Then the temperature increase outside, and this means that the top water become warmer, and the bottom water become less warm, and so they are denser, and a kind of a stratification appears in the lake with the 3 different situations, which are the so-called epilimnium and hypolimnium in the bottom, and the density jump is called metalimnium. So we have in reality we have 2 lakes in only one ecosystem. Then the situation gone with the autumn circulation, with always like in spring, where metalimnium disappear, and if it's very cold, like in here in Italy, where when there are small lakes and there is a very cold winter, ice can appear and a reverse winter circulation happens. So there is another isolation of the ecosystem with consequences on the ecosystem. Another important parameters for life in a lake is oxygen, made by photosynthesis, and the important things to know is that oxygen solubility decrease with temperature. So this can be a problem with an increasing of temperature in a lake. And another variable very important is phosphorus, fundamental for life, or plant life in particular. There is a natural phosphorus for runoff, and the so-called anthropogenic phosphorus, which is as the consequence of the so-called eutrophication. So a lot of nutrients, phosphorus is mainly in water. This is a natural process, but increases with the human actions leading to an excess of vegetation and destroying the natural equilibrium of ecosystems. Among the causes, which are mainly anthropic, there is, which are the acceleration of this natural process. There is an increase of human activities, problem with the discharges, and the increase of temperature. The effects are well known with anoxia and the bad quality of water. So the effect of climatic changes on physical and chemical point of view are mainly shifts in circulation of the water column, less dissolved oxygen in water, increase of eutrophication due to increase of temperature, and the decrease of water transparencies. But has been already in some way seen in some lakes, as already known, for example, in Lake Maggiore, where the full circulation is every 7 years. They thought, but with a lot of accumulation of it in the last 50 years. And in the future, we don't know what's happening with the increase in temperature, how will be the situation. We know that there is a climatic memory in times. The most complete data are on Lake Maggiore because it's well studied from a lot of years. What about the organism? This is a simple food web in a natural condition in a pelagic area of a lake where the sun is always the main force to move and to develop to make the development of phytoplankton. Then there are the first and secondary consumers, the so-called zooplankton, and then there are fish, zooplanktivorous and predatory, and everything is closed by detritivores and decomposers, so the cycle is closed. What's happened if climatic change, what could happen, or what we know already about the climatic changes on plankton? There are problems with the physiological processes such as ingestion, respiration, reproductive development of animal whose internal temperature varies considerably as zooplankton. Some evidence suggests that plankton are particularly sensitive indicators of change than even environmental variables themselves. There will be surely a size structure and taxonomic composition that can change, since phytoplankton could become poor in biodiversity and of poor nutrition quality. And there are alterations in the distribution of many groups for floating, which could change in relation to density and temperature. As concern fish, for example, there are these problems and others with problems of self-regulate internal temperature, determination of sex, which is temperature dependent, and so probably promoting greater proportion of males in many populations. So lowered biodiversity, incoming of new species, alien species, size structure and taxonomic composition could therefore change. So a lot of problem from an ecosystems from the ecosystem point of view. What are we studying or would like to do in on Lake Como, which is next to our university? The idea is to make sediment cores in the lake and make studies about paleolimnological research to reconstruct temperature, firstly, and to see if proxy, chironomics, ostracods, diatoms, cladocerans, which are fossils present in sediments, can tell us something about the effects of climatic changes. Even the eDNA which as just explained by the colleague, could be another idea to be applied. And for example, chironomics are very important are very good proxy to tell us which are the cold periods and the warmer periods during time. And so this is a very interesting feature. And the last idea would be always to be applied on Lake Como ecosystem, since we have more or less 10 years, not much, but 10 years of not so long-term data, but we have 10 years of data on zooplankton and fish to make some ecosystem models to be applied on zooplankton and fish to make prediction for future and to see future scenarios. Thank you for your attention. Ok, interrompo. Okay, I think now there is Diana. I think Diana, you can share your screen, but we can't hear you. Okay.
Okay, do you hear me? Okay.
Okay.
I'm really very happy to be here in front of so many PhD students in this school, and I enjoy this time, enjoyed the communication of my colleagues and your presence here, especially the students, the PhD students. Now I will start with my short communication. And analyzing the effect of climate change on groundwater ecosystems. Just explaining what lies beneath, because this kind of ecosystems are poorly known worldwide, sorry. Putting together the anthropogenic threat complexes and the global groundwater crisis, some main points to be stressed. Groundwater constitutes the 33% of the total water withdrawal. Climate change is altering the groundwater ecosystem and impairing the ecosystem services they provide to human well-being. Cities are critically expanding in size, leading to a rise in groundwater demand by 80% within 2050. Moreover, an increase of 5 degrees Celsius is expected in the aquifer beneath the cities. And this is a warming topic. Climate change, by altering the water cycle, as explained also by my colleagues, represent the main challenge of sustaining groundwater supply for any use in the future. Concentration quality decrease along with its decrease in quantity, what I call the concentration effect. And no less relevant, many surface freshwater rely upon groundwater. And just to use a wonderful sentence by Famiglietti, 2014, surface and groundwater must be managed conjunctively as one water. Well, groundwater storage is rapidly declining, as you can see on the left in the graph, rapidly declining at the global scale. And on the right, you can see that surface water are responding in the same way, because they lowered due to the aquifer depletion. This was showed in several contributions. I reported here only one from a North China plain, and you can see the stream flow lowering along with the aquifer below the stream lowering. And again, groundwater depletion contributes to global sea level rise. As you can see, there is an increasing and steep contribution of groundwater depletion to global sea level rise, and it's expected that nearly 100% of the groundwater extracted eventually ends up in the ocean, thus contributing in a significant way in increasing global river rise. But the groundwater is not only to be viewed under quality and quantity, because it is an ecosystem itself. And several other ecosystems rely upon groundwater. So I introduced the concept of groundwater-dependent ecosystems, which are ecosystems whose biological structure and ecological processes are directly or indirectly influenced by groundwater. And just a short movie for showing you this degree of dependency.
Dependent ecosystems, or GDE, are natural systems that need groundwater for their health. They include rivers, wetlands, and streams, as well as vegetation and plains.
But these GDEs represent only the tip of the iceberg, actually. So there are several kinds of GDEs. The first level of classification divides surface GDEs from subsurface GDEs. Surface GDEs are surface water and land depending on subsurface availability of groundwater. Subsurface GDE, which are represented by the true groundwater, are groundwater communities and their interaction within the underground with the underground physical-chemical and hydrogeological environmental describers. And the groundwater-dependent ecosystem in spring, river banks, caves, and groundwater-fed estuaries directly affect aquatic and terrestrial species on Earth. And here in this picture, you can see how many types of GDEs are known around the world. There is a second level of classification given by Emerson in quarter 2006, and based on the degree of dependency of surface water on land or groundwater. So starting by the first level, groundwater ecosystem are the first GDEs, where many species complete the whole life cycle in groundwater and only in groundwater. This fauna is called the stygofauna. And this class includes also the hyporheic zone of river and floodplains. There is the second level, ecosystem reliant on surface extraction of groundwater, and includes flow rivers, streams, wetlands, springs, and estuarine seagrasses. And finally, ecosystem reliant on subsurface presence of groundwater within the rooting depth of the ecosystem. And these are actually terrestrial ecosystems, depending on groundwater. And this picture here showing the aquatic GDEs and the SGDEs. On the left, the groundwater fed springs. As you can see, there are point and diffuse upwelling of the aquifer at the surface of the spring. On the right, in the upper right, the hyporheic zone of streams, rivers, and the fauna hosted by this environment. And on the right, at the bottom, the two SGDEs, for instance, cave waters, the saturated aquifer and the unsaturated aquifers in this case in the caves. But we have also alluvial aquifers, and we have also aquifer in fractured aquifers, rocks, sorry. And what's about the stygofauna? Out of sight, out of mind? Unfortunately, the answer is yes. Because neither the Water Framework Directive nor the Groundwater Directive, neither the Habitat Directive have taken into account this fauna, with a few exceptions for the Habitat Directive, where only 3 stygobites are listed as endangered. For the rest, they are known to specialists. So we were forced to write a letter. Don't forget subterranean ecosystem in climate change agendas, because despite the ecological dimension of groundwater is known since decades, its biodiversity is still almost completely underestimated. And the groundwater fauna is unique on its own side, because sometimes this fauna represents the sole remnants of ancient faunas that disappeared elsewhere, both in land and surface freshwater. So they are called frequently living fossils. Furthermore, stygobites play key ecosystem service for human well-being, as you can see on the right of our picture: bioremediation, ecosystem functioning, roost for bats and birds, and so on. Linking together climate change and the ATC in GDEs, as you can see on the right, under the effect of climate change, there are several expected effects on GDEs: habitat destruction, loss of sensitive species, changes in structure and functioning of GDEs, loss of GDEs ecosystem services. And all these effects are much more relevant in small aquifers, because small aquifers are less resilient. And for this small aquifer, rapid catastrophic ecological changes are expected, because they have a low discharge and are much more sensitive to high variation in heat, water, and nutrient fluxes. Large aquifers are more resilient. So for this, there is a buffering situation expected in the present and in the very next future. One of the main threats is represented by the marine intrusion in coastal groundwater. And this is one of the main threats in the Mediterranean area. In Italy, in the small coastal aquifer in the peninsular Italy, in the main island, in the Maghrebian region, and in Greece, in Spain, and beyond in Australia, in the Caribbean area. So it's a serious threat. And just for showing you the dynamics of this event, here another movie for you. And now the question may be, but is this a worst predicted scenario? Unfortunately, again, the answer is not at all, because we have several coastal aquifers across the world which already undergone salinification. So they are no longer usable for drinking purposes, for agriculture, and for industry uses. Now the final question, the main challenge, how stegobites can adapt to climate change related ATCs. We have not enough data for as for surface environment in land and surface water and so on. It just inspiring by the wonderful paper by Bellard and Co. 2012, who simplified the Hutchinsonian and dimensional niche along time, self, and space. We can analyze what happened for the stegofauna and the stegobiont species. Well, on space, have they the potential to move in other areas where climate change is less effective? The answer is that this dispersal is unlikely, because most stegobiont species has low altitude for dispersal, the habitats have a moderate to low connectivity, and by sure, stegobiont cannot jump the wall between one aquifer to another one. Over time, there is another compelling factor, because they live in total darkness. They have no circadian rhythms. They have no phenological cycles. So the potential for answering to changes in temperature and changes in the concentration of pollutants are potentially very low. Also because they have a long lifespan, low reproductive rate, and self-response in physiology. Based to our best knowledge, there is poor metabolic plasticity among stegobiont species, likely linked to standing genetic variation. But this last point is still open to question, as you can see. So the question is, for stegobiont, how many degrees of freedom? Actually, likely very low. They are at the end of their life if climate change continues to rise in this so rapid way in the last decades. And just to summarize the main research topics we are carrying out in collaboration with the CNR of Florence and Verbania Pallanza in Italy and some other colleagues in the world. Our activities are, our hotspot activities are the following: construction of expert-based big data on the GDE biodiversity at the European scale, still in course. Ecological risk assessment in GDEs, still done. Effect of pollutants on the behavior of GDE species, also below the threshold value established by the member state and the environmental quality standard assessed by the European Community. Functional ecology of the GDEs, linking anthropogenic treat complexes in GDEs and the biodiversity response, searching for GDE species as indicators of groundwater quality and quantity under the new global change scenario, special analysis of GDE species from the ecological to the biogeographic perspectives, which are interrelated to each other, and finally predicting species distribution under different scenarios of climate change and trends of the ATC by using SDM and joint SDM. Here the take-home message for you, I will not read them. You can retain for you these main points of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And sorry for being so speedy, just for gaining time for you. Thank you.
Okay, I think you can hear me. Thank you, Diana. Well, I think the last for this morning, but definitely the saltiest one, because I'm going to talk about marine ecosystems, and especially with the potential significance and the help that marine restoration could provide us to exploit in a more sustainable way oceans resources, and specifically the Mediterranean Sea one. But before doing this, I'd like first to introduce what is the basis of the problem of having a healthy ocean and sustainably use its resources. This is based basically on the relationship that exists between biodiversity and ecosystem functions. Let me say that after some like 40 years of experiments, manipulative experiments and correlative analysis, we know definitely that biodiversity is positively related with ecosystem functioning. The shape of the relationship can change according to the different role of the species composing the community. But anyway, we can expect that any impact of, that any loss of biodiversity, namely a decrease in the number of species of a community, has a negative impact on the ecosystem functioning. And this is a problem because now on our planet, we are experiencing a global loss of biodiversity to the point that it has been estimated that rates of extinctions, current rates of extinctions, are from 10 to 100 higher than those that occurred 66 million ago during the well-known dinosaurs extinction, which is huge. I mean, okay, this means that the time needed to see a global extinction event is very short. This is occurring also in the marine ecosystem, whether, I mean, the rate of extinction is much lower than those that we can observe in terrestrial environments. But as you can see in these, in the panel on the right, you can see that Worm and collaborators in 2006 in Science have predicted that by 2100, 80% of the marine taxa in large marine ecosystems that are well far from the coastal environments, will go extinct or collapse, numerically collapse. Why we have to be concerned about the biodiversity loss? First, we have to understand why should we care of ocean health. And there are two potential points of view. One is ecological, linked to the knowledge of relationships between organisms and their environment. The second one is an anthropocentric point of view. Well, we have already heard today that the oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, to the point that an alien coming for the first time to our planet, seeing a blue planet, would most probably not calling it Earth, but possibly ocean. Jokes apart, we know that the oceans are the largest three-dimensional environment for life, with a volume of 1.34 million cubic kilometers, which contain, even dominated by very small organisms, most of them are unicellular, 90% of the whole biosphere. But the oceans provide human beings also with basic and fundamental services, including, for instance, the provision of 50% of the atmospheric oxygen that we and animals and all organisms in our planet breathe. Definitely so, the oceans are the vastest ecosystem on Earth and contain life at all depths, from the coastal rocky pools that you can see in the central picture here in this slide, down to the deepest part of the ocean, down to 11 kilometer depth in the Mariana Trench. So they are important in ecological terms, they sustain life on our planet. But what we have to say is also that Oceans are major sources of goods and services for the human beings. They provide food and a huge amount of different materials, but as we have learned just now, they provide services. But these have an economic value, which is extremely important for the global economy, to the point that the exploitation of oceans resources sustain what we call the blue economy, which is huge. Just consider that summing up economic, environmental, and human health benefits, accounting to some like $10 trillion, are 5 times higher the benefits that we can extract than the cost that we sustain to extract resources. If you look at the importance of benefits from the use from the blue economy on the human health, we see that 50% of the total benefits deal with our health, with the human health. This means that preserving oceans, maintaining a good health of oceans means that we human beings will have a good and health. The problem is that in the last 100 years or so, something more probably, humans have introduced a plethora of pressures on the ocean, a huge number of multiple stressors that have led to a dramatic increase of the cumulative human impacts on the ocean because of direct and indirect pressures. Direct pressures or stressors include, for instance, pollution, and indirect pressures include the different manifestations of climate change on the ocean, about which we are going to talk shortly. These cumulative human impacts, in this slide, you can see a map produced by Halpern and collaborators in 2019, where you can see the dramatic increase, the annual increase in the decade 2003-2013 in the amount of cumulative human impacts. These are impairing the marine ecosystems' integrity because they are degrading, impairing their resistance, their ability to resist to disturbance, and also their resilience, their ability to return to an equilibrium after, if in case we will be able to do it, the disturbance, the impacts are seized and are eliminated. Focusing on the Mediterranean Sea from that map, but also from the map produced with the same approach by Micheli and collaborators in 2013 in +1, the Mediterranean Sea, okay, is one of the most compromised regions in the world. In the oceans, we could say that there is no area unaffected by human influence, even at the deepest ocean, even in the Mariana Trench. But the Mediterranean Sea is a sort of hotspot of cumulative human impacts. And the problem is that together these impacts produced by a plethora, a huge number of different pressures and stressors are interacting and are also driven by the two most important manifestations of climate change on marine ecosystems, that are the decrease of the pH, what is called ocean acidification, and sea surface warming. Making a complete and exhaustive list of human pressures on the Mediterranean Sea would take possibly hours and hours. This is why I try to concentrate on 3 examples of this pressure, just to give you an idea of the problems we are facing now and that we will face in the next decades. Talking about the effects of bottom trawling, destructive fishery practice, of pollution, and the spread of invasive species. Bottom trawling is definitely the most impacting fishery practice, especially when it is carried out chronically and most intensively. In the pictures that you can see right left in this slide, you can see that where bottom trawling is conducted chronically and intensively, in this picture you can see that each single yellow dot represents the presence and activity of a bottom trawler, determines a total change in the shape and morphology of the sea bottom. consider that the depth where this effect is observed is higher than 500-meter depth. This is because bottom trawling that have almost exhausted all fishery along the continental shelf within the first 200-meter depth now is going deeper and deeper. This a factor which is huge because interests dozens and dozens of square kilometers of the sea bottom in the North Mediterranean Sea, has also direct effects on erect organisms, including, for instance, deep corals, which are totally destroyed by the presence of this activity. Here you can see in the picture A and C, the difference in the quality, let's say, of corals, where bottom trawling is not present, they are alive, complex and vital, and dead corals and destroyed corals where bottom trawling is present. This kind of activity, however, has the capability to profoundly impact on biodiversity. Chronically trawled environments, like the one I showed here in this canyon along the Northern Mediterranean Sea, have seen the decrease of biodiversity by 50%, and the decrease in 37% of the biogeochemical cycling in these environments, with consequences that are not only linked to the loss of the resource or loss of sea bottom integrity, but also on their ability to provide goods and services to the whole Mediterranean Sea. When we talk about pollution, we know that everywhere in the world, and this applies specifically to the Mediterranean Sea, are repositories of a huge amount of marine litter. On the left, you can see 4 pictures showing the typologies and huge amount of waste obtained after professional bottom trawling along the coast of Sardinia. These have been collected down to more than 1,000 meter depth and show a huge amount of wastes. But you can also see that most of these wastes, of this litter, is made specifically of plastics. This is a well-known problem which deals specifically to the smaller particles of plastic, microplastics and nanoplastic, which can accidentally being used by as food by, for instance, commercially valuable species like the Norwegian langoustines, which ingest accumulates, and this could be a problem. Even the effects are not have been not yet fully understood. Also for human beings that eat these organisms. The third problem I'm going to cite is the one dealing with the spread of invasive alloctonic species. In the last 60 years, the Mediterranean Sea, mostly because of maritime transport, but most because of the opening 100 years ago of the Suez Channel, have experienced an increase in the number of species coming from abroad. And the number of species that are present, that are alloctonous to the Mediterranean Sea, accounts now to some like 1,000 species. Some of these species, not all, have, however, an invasive behavior, which in the case, for instance, of the alga Caulerpa cylindracea, have impacted severely the capacity of sediments within seagrass beds. I'm talking about, for instance, the endemic Posidonia oceanica seagrass, to the point that the ability of these sediments to provide a contribution to biogeochemical cycles is decreased by more than 50%. The problem is also economic, because if you look at this graphic down here, provided by Curantidu and collaborators in Neobiota last year, the amount of total cost for the management specifically of invasive alien species accounts for up to 10,000 million euros, depending on the country where these costs are sustained. And then there is climate change. 2 examples, very fast examples. First, we know that in the Mediterranean Sea, there are 3 regions, namely the Northwestern Mediterranean Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Aegean Sea, where there is the formation of the so-called dense shelf waters. This is a phenomenon that occurs typically during winter months, because cold and dry winds coming from the northern regions determine an increase because of evaporation of salinity, but also an increase of density because of a decreasing temperature of surface waters. These become definitely denser and sink. While sinking, they transport the food present in the shallowest part of the continental shelf, and specifically through canyons, they inject to the deep sea, where they fuel with energy, with food, the deep sea communities. The problem is that since the Mediterranean Sea is among the regions worldwide where sea surface water are increasing and increasing, this phenomenon is expected to decrease, even not to cease, determining definitely impoverishment of an already oligotrophic poor Mediterranean Sea, interrupting what is called the Robin Hood effect, which rob the rich, the shallow bentos where there is food, to give to the poor where bentos is low, to the deep sea bentos. The second problem of CO2, the so-called ocean acidification, the decrease of pH will most probably impair the ability of calcifying organisms like the precious red coral to build their skeletons, with effects that are biological per se, but also can be predicted to have an influence also on the economic value of these organisms. Well, what we could do to counteract this? Well, we could ineluctably wait for the ocean to recover, based that this will imply that we have the ability and the capability to remove the sources of disturbance. And you know, this is not always completely and socially feasible because of the cost associated with diminishing the human pressures on the ocean. But contemporarily, at the same time, we can intervene by helping the recovery through ecological restoration. Well, marine restoration is, let's say, a young practice that has been applied to date only on very local scale, but it could be an effective strategy to accelerate the recovery of degraded ecosystem. This comes out clearly from this panel provided by Cartuse's collaborators in 2018, where among the four possible solutions to counteract ocean self-decline, protecting the ecosystem with marine protected areas, addressing climate change causes that most countries in the world are doing, managing solar radiation, and applying marine restoration. Among these, as you can see from the size of these yellow dots, protecting ecosystems and marine restoration provide permanent effects. The duration of the effects of these activities can be considered permanent. So the most effective to counteract the decline of ocean health. Well, this is well recognized by the United Nations that in the same decade to which they dedicated to the ocean science knowledge, they also dedicated this decade, the same decade, 2021, 2030, to ecosystem restoration. And within this framework and within the Italian National Plan for Recovery and Resilience, at the University of Cagliari, we are carrying out a project, we are leading a project of national interest named MARES, Marine Habitats Restoration in a Climate Change Impaired Mediterranean Sea, that through a systematic analysis of the literature, but also a plethora of field and manipulative experiments, and specifically dedicated modeling exercise, is investigating the efficacy of the restoration of some peculiar Mediterranean habitats, including, for instance, seagrass beds, but also coralligenous habitats, under the conditions simulating the expected sea warming by 2100. I'm sorry for having used a few minutes more than planned, and I leave room to questions, if any.
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, I'm opening. Okay, the first one deals with the Seaspiracy documentary by Sea Shepherd. I think that the message contained in that document is some like, let's say, not fully correct, because they put in the same basket professional fisheries, which are a destroying activity because there are trawlers that are long, that are as long as 400 meters that in one day can collect hundreds of tons of fish, and not only fish, can destroy large portion of the ocean. But they put together also what is called small fisheries, made by small boats, okay, with not destructive practices. I do not agree fully with the message provided by Cispirali, because again, putting together these so different practices is extremely important. The second question deals with future bottom trawling banning. There are a lot of activities that are going to be done about this problem. An exercise has been already done in the Adriatic Sea, whether after at least 5 or 6 years of trials, Italy decided to stop, for instance, bottom trawling in a certain area. The problem is that, you know, most or some of the areas where bottom trawling, especially the deep sea one, is carried out are not under the control of nations, but are done in large marine ecosystems, okay? So there is not an international legislation that covers this aspect, and this is a huge problem. There are, however, positive trials. For instance, after the paper that I cited about the impacts of bottom trawling for the fishery of the red shrimp in the northern Mediterranean Sea in the Catalonia region, the Catalonia government invested a lot of money and provided the fishermen with less impactant or even not impactant nets that do not use any system that goes on top of the sea bottom, but simply, let's say, fly above it. This eliminates the negative impacts, at least on the seabed morphology and on species that live directly in the sediment. Thank you for the questions. I think it's time for Dennis to.
Yes. So I think thank you very much again for the for this very exciting morning session. So now is the time to have a break and meet again in an hour and a half, I think, at around 3, right? For the health, health part, and of course the biotechnology and our invited lecture. So have a nice lunch break. See you in about 90 minutes. Thank you.
See you later. Bye.
See you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you later.